if we can instead harness our innate sociability through activities like storytelling and arguing and debating with each other and teaching other people, then we bring in this whole suite of other cognitive abilities that remain dormant when we're just alone thinking, sitting at our desks, maybe with our earbuds in and not interacting with other people.
Hello everyone, my name is Stephen Parton and you are listening to the Feedback Loop on Singularity Radio, where we keep you up to date on the latest technological trends and how they're impacting the transformation of consciousness and culture. This week our guest is science writer Annie Murphy-Paul, who just recently released her latest book, The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. In The Extended Mind, Annie takes us on a tour of the different types of intelligence we're able to tap into, focusing primarily on three often overlooked forms: thinking with our bodies, thinking with our surroundings, and thinking with our relationships. In this episode, we explore those ideas in much greater detail, and we also dig into how these forms of thinking relate to our use of technology and to our work lives, including how to be a better manager and a better leader. Now, if you're interested in having more conversations like this that you've been hearing on this podcast, consider joining our free community where these kind of conversations are taking place regularly. For instance, you can join myself and dozens of other members of the community at one of our virtual events that we host every other Tuesday. If you do decide to join, please come find me in the room and let's have a chat about some of the things you're interested in. But until then, let's jump into this episode. Everyone, please welcome to the Feedback Loop, Annie Murphy-Paul. Well, then let's just use that as our jumping off point. To start then, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and what actually motivated you to write your latest book, which, for those who may not know, is The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside of the Brain.
Yeah, so I'm a science writer, and my beat is writing about research on learning and cognition. That's become what I write about. In any case, I would say that more narrowly, I had been writing a lot about the science of learning, and I kept finding lots of really interesting threads of research that seemed in some way to me to connect to each other, but I couldn't really figure out how they connected. And I'm talking about research in embodied cognition, which is the idea that we think with the movements and gestures of our bodies and the sensations of our bodies, and situated cognition, the idea that where we are affects the way we think, and then socially distributed cognition, which means that we don't think with our own brains alone, but we join our minds with other people's in a kind of collective intelligence. And then I ran across an article that was written by two philosophers and published in 1998. The philosophers were Andy Clark and David Chalmers. They wrote an article called The Extended Mind, and the very first sentence of the article said something like, where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin? And this to me was, a fascinating question, a provocative question, because our usual answer to that question would be, well, it stops at the skull. It stops at, at the boundary of your own head. But Clark and Chalmers were advancing this theory, this notion that actually our thinking processes are spread across, the body, physical spaces, the minds of other people. And also what they were most interested in are tools, our devices, our technologies, and how we use those as kind of an extension of our minds. And so when I read this article, I realized that this was the big idea that was pulling together all these different strands of research that I had been interested in. And this was what I was looking for in the sense of a new way of thinking about thinking, a new way of conceptualizing what it is we do when we attempt difficult cognitive tasks. That all that activity is not happening here. It's actually happening, in a much wider frame. So that became the subject of my book.
And you touched on it there, but the book also breaks down into those three parts, which are thinking with our bodies, thinking with our surroundings, and thinking with our relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Could you kind of just take us on a little bit of a tour of what each of those really looks like, perhaps starting with thinking with our bodies?
Yeah. So, in Western culture, we have this very old bias, that mind and body are separate, and that the body is sort of animal and grubby and, irrational and unruly, and that the mind is something more celestial and, elevated. And in fact, what scientists have been discovering and demonstrating more and more is how very interconnected the brain and the rest of the body are, and how influenced the brain is by the body, and not just in the other direction. We think of the brain sort of telling the body what to do, but in fact, the brain is receiving this constant flow of information from within the body. And that's actually the topic of the first chapter within that section, thinking about the brain. I write about a phenomenon known as interoception, which is the capacity to sense those internal sensations, as opposed to the way we collect all this information from the outside world through our senses. We also have this flow of information that's constantly being generated within our bodies. And it's my argument, it's my contention in that chapter that we that flow of internal sensation, which many of us kind of suppress or ignore, actually has a lot of information to share with us. It actually is a way of cueing us into a wealth of non-conscious knowledge that we have stored, but is not accessible to us except through these kind of little pokes and prods that arise from our bodies. So the more interoceptively attuned we are, the more we can take advantage of the stuff that we know, but we don't know we know it, if you know what I mean. And then the other two chapters in that section are about thinking with gesture, the way that the movements of our hands are actually part of our thinking processes, and also thinking with like whole body movements, like the way that, say, taking a walk helps to prime our brains to think in a more dynamic and creative way. The idea is that by moving our bodies in certain ways, we can induce our brains to think in certain ways, which again is kind of turning that causal arrow around. We think of the brain as telling the body what to do, but in many ways we can influence the state or the operation of the brain by moving the body.
Do you think that Italians think better because they gesture a lot?
you know
I can't be the first person who
yeah,
has
I was
asked
going to say,
that.
what, I actually get that question quite a lot. Yes. There is research. What I can say is that there is research suggesting that when you suppress the urge to, when you suppress the urge to move, but also when you suppress or require others not to gesture, then people's thinking suffers. So it does stand to reason that the more you gesture, the more fluent your speech is, and the more fluent your thinking is. So I think, yes, the Italians may have an edge over the rest of us.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you've done if your research led you to this, but this is a topic that's fascinating to me as well. And if I remember correctly, one of the things that I've come to find is that gesturing actually seems to have led to the expansion in the part of the brain that deals with language, and that a lot of it was like mirror neurons, and our attempt to repeat gestures started to promote language. And I think it's in Broca's area. I don't know. I was just wondering if that's something that you've came across, because it seems like a really close tie.
Yeah, well, verbal language and gestures are really closely interconnected, but if anything, gesture came first. Linguists think that gestures were our first means of communication, and that verbal language came later. And even to this day, babies, when they're learning language, they start gesturing and conveying meaning through gesture before they're able to say words. So we kind of recapitulate that that human history. But also, it's the case that gesture is we might think of it as this kind of clumsy accompaniment to speech, but it's actually often a few steps ahead of what we're saying in words. And our newest and most advanced and most cutting edge ideas often show up first in the movements of our hands. That's before we're able to put words to an idea, and then we can actually sort of bootstrap our thinking. We can read off of our hands, the motions of our hands, some element that informs our verbal account of what we're trying to explain or understand. So really, gestures, far from being a kind of lagging indicator, they're actually at the cutting edge of our thought processes.
And do you think that has any tie in with the way writing tends to help people remember things? Like for me personally, I love using pen and paper versus typing something, because typing feels very standardized. Like every button click is just a button click, and then it creates a
Yes.
thing that looks the same. But when I write it, it's got a very unique set of curves and movements that I perform. And I really
Yes.
think that empowers my thought.
Yes, yes. No, there's evidence there too to suggest that forming letters, as you say, when you form letters with a pen in your hand, each letter is different. Whereas, tapping each key on a keyboard it feels the same, and it doesn't have the same memory inducing effect or memory consolidating effect as uh, writing something by hand. But I think there's an even bigger difference between putting words down on paper, whether it's with a computer or with a pen, and keeping it in our heads. That's we off I it's my view, and I think it's supported by the evidence, that we try to do too much in our heads and keep too much in our minds, rather than offloading our thoughts and ideas, and thereby getting some perspective and some distance on them. And there's evidence to suggest that we get what a psychologist calls a detachment benefit from taking those ideas out of our head, putting some space between us and them, and we see them differently. And I think writers or anyone who's who has struggled to articulate an idea finds that they deal with those ideas differently when they're down on paper than when they're still in our heads.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say that one of the things I love about writing is that when it is on the paper, I can judge it objectively, but when it's in my
Mm-hmm.
mind, I'm stuck in the
Mm-hmm.
subjective lens,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm
Exactly.
biased, and it doesn't help me work through anything.
Right, right, right.
You talk about interoception there, and one of the things you talked about is some of us are more tuned to it versus others. And I'm wondering, what are some of the ways maybe that we can increase that attunement, that we can maybe become more aware of what's going on in our body?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the methods for increasing interoceptive attunement that's received the most research support is it's a component of mindfulness meditation that's known as the body scan. And that is a practice wherein you bring open, non-judgmental, curious attention to those sensations that are arising in your body. And one way to do it is to focus sort of on one part of the body at a time. And the idea is just to, again, not to judge it, not to feel like you need to do anything about it, just to be aware of these sensations that are there all the time, whether it's you can feel your heart beating, or you can feel a tightness in your chest or your stomach, just to feel what's going on and to tap into that flow of sensation that is, again, with us all the time, but that we so often, when we're not meditating, when we're not consciously attending to it, we tend to just overlook.
And in your research, have you come across any work that suggests that doing this increases your thinking capacities? Like, have they had people do tests before and after a body scan, for instance, and said, okay, this person actually was more creative, more productive, was able to more quickly solve this problem? Was there any work like that done that you've seen?
Yeah, it seems to increase, being more interoceptively attuned seems to increase our resilience, including our cognitive resilience, meaning our ability to persist with a difficult cognitive or mental task, and to rebound from adversity or challenge, because those internal signals there, that's a moment by moment kind of gauge of our energy levels and how much capacity we have to take on a difficult task. So when they're out of tune with that, when they're not aware of where their body is in a sense, then they can easily get overwhelmed, or they're surprised by the fact that they suddenly feel irritable or tired, or not capable of undertaking a challenge. Whereas if you're in tune and in touch with those internal signals, you can kind of manage your energy reserves better. You can prepare yourself for a challenge. You can kind of maintain yourself through that challenge, and then you can recover once the challenge is over in a much more effective way than if you were sort of cut off from your body and all the information that your body has to share.
And do you think there's ever a chance that could be deceptive or misleading? Because when you were saying that brings to mind truth detectors, or lie detectors, and there's some evidence that says, yeah, 85% to 95% of the time these are accurate. The APA, I believe, on the other hand, has said that replication study after replication study says that they're not really accurate, because people's sweaty palms or heart rate or whatnot can be a result of just being afraid of having the conversation and not of answering with a lie. So I don't know if that's something that you looked into, but to me it feels like maybe like my palms are sweaty because I'm scared to give this speech, and because I know that I don't have to be as scared, or maybe
Yes. No, two thoughts about that. One is that being attuned to those ground level bodily signals can actually help you intervene in that process of constructing an emotion, because as you note, an emotion like nervousness has exactly the same physiological correlates as a state like excitement. And when we tune in not to the idea that I'm so nervous, but rather, what am I actually feeling? Okay, my heart is beating faster. I have some butterflies in my stomach. My palms are sweaty. Well, maybe that's my body getting me ready for a challenge. It's prepping me for this, this difficult thing that I'm about to attempt. And I'm feeling ready. I'm feeling pretty excited for this, so you can kind of get in on the ground floor in terms of constructing that emotion from the fundamental or basic parts of the raw materials of the bodily response. But then another thought that came to mind when you mentioned, can those be misleading, those internal signals? That's actually what happens, or part of what happens when people suffer a panic attack, is that often they are tuning in a little too much to their bodies, and they say they feel that they're not getting enough oxygen and their breathing is becoming really shallow and rapid. That can actually feed on itself and lead to a full-blown panic attack. So interestingly, the recommended treatment for that is called interoceptive exposure, where you kind of get a little taste of that interoceptive feeling. You might a clinician might have you blow into a paper bag or through a straw or something, but you do it in a very safe and controlled setting, and you learn, your body and your mind learns over time that, no, actually I'm fine, and my breathing may be a little bit quick and shallow, but I'm not gonna, this is not, I'm not under threat. And so we can learn, as long as we're attuned to our internal signals, we can learn to work with them.
And that's just a form of exposure therapy, really, at that point, right? Yeah.
Right.
And now, what about thinking with your environment? This is one that I really enjoy as well. Can you talk a little bit about how we think with our environment?
Sure. Yeah. And this is where I really get into a main theme of the book, which is that the brain is not a computer. The brain is, there's a very common metaphor that undergirds a lot of the way that we talk about the brain, which is that the brain is like a computer. And this is one way in which a computer is quite different from a brain. Our brains are really sensitive to, they're really responsive to the environment and the context in which we do our thinking, which is not the case for a computer. My laptop here will operate just the same here in my living room as it would if I took it to the park, So, but people and their mental processes work very differently depending on where we are. And one of the clearest examples of that is that the way we respond to being in nature. And, a lot of us know already that when we go into nature, when we spend time in nature, we feel more relaxed, more laid back, and sort of more at ease. But there's a reason for that, which is that, human beings evolved in an outdoor setting, this life we live now where we're inside a house or a car like upwards of 90% of the time. That's a very modern, recent development. But we evolved to live outdoors, and our brains evolved to process the stimuli that are found in nature in a very effortless and easy and in a way that is actually very pleasing and pleasant. And that's part of why we often find that our mood is elevated when we're outside. And the way that our attention is engaged by nature, say by rolling waves or by leaves that are rustling in the wind, it's a very diffuse and kind of the phrase that psychologists use to describe it is soft fascination. It's very different from the hard-edged kind of attention that we have to pay to our work or our studies if we're a student. And so spending time in nature is a way to sort of refill the tank of our attentional resources, because our attention, although it's being sort of pleasantly diverted when we're outdoors, it's not being drained and drawn down the way it is when we have to focus on our work. So we can go outside, spend some time outside, and then come back to our work with our attentional capacities refreshed.
I suspect then, if you're talking about soft fascination, that you looked at the attention restoration theory from Kaplan and Kaplan. Yes. And that's, so can you talk, that is one of my favorite bodies of work. So I really love that. Can you talk a little bit more about that directed versus like a more passive form of attention, and maybe how you think that's affecting us in this very like digital, concrete, fast moving world that we live in versus maybe the natural environment?
Yeah, well, you mentioned fast moving modern world, and that's another contrast that is brought up by attention restoration theory. It's not just the contrast between nature and the way it engages our attention and the way our work, of sort of focusing on abstract symbols, how that engages our attention very differently, but also nature as opposed to more urban or built settings or being indoors. There's a lot of straight angles in a built setting. There's a lot of loud noises, fast moving cars and people, and that's a very different setting from nature, where things tend to be again, the stimuli tends to be more diffuse, more sort of more soft edged, and also there's a lot of variety in terms of color and hue, but within a restricted range. So like lots of green and more green, but so all these things are sort of easy on the mind in a way that urban or built settings are not.
So what are your thoughts on how that maybe affects our intelligence and our well-being, maybe from a socioeconomic or like kind of equality point of view? Because if we're talking there about an urban environment causing more amygdala activation, and you're more vigilant, and you're less able to kind of like access the carefree part of your brain that maybe thinks more critically, what does that mean for people who live with parks and yards and have all this open space versus people who are living next to a busy highway and a train, and have cars honking and bars right outside their window? Like, obviously they're going to think differently.
Yeah. And one of the themes that I tried to bring out in the extended mind is the fact that once we accept that these things outside our brain have such a big impact on how well we think, then we have to really look at the fact that, and take stock of the fact that these mental extensions are in no way equitably distributed, and that includes access to nature and green spaces. The New York Times had an amazing piece a couple of months ago that looked at how much more green, almost on a block by block basis, affluent neighborhoods were, as opposed to poor neighborhoods, less affluent neighborhoods. And I think we know, in a sense, that even as we are a very brain bound society, we do tend to locate intelligence in the brain. But I think at the same time, our behavior shows that we understand that these mental extensions, like access to nature and green space, really do make a difference, because the price of those things is bid up. You pay more for an apartment overlooking Central Park than you do one that overlooks a brick wall. So and of course, people who have the resources and who have the privilege take advantage of those things and are able to kind of engage in the rich get richer cycle, wherein money buys you mental extensions and it buys you the ability to think better. And I think that's a big contributor to inequality in our society that we haven't really looked at very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think about the kind of, I guess, reconciliation between thinking with the benefit of a device or an external neural system of some kind, whether it's a notebook or like a smartphone that you take notes with, and the effect of having digital objects in the environment, and maybe the almost Pavlovian or dopamine dripping effect that they have.
Well, a couple thoughts there. One is that human beings have been thinking outside the brain, extending their minds for time immemorial. So this is it's not a new thing. And I don't think it's something we should be afraid of, in the sense of, oh my God, if we delegate all our mental faculties to our devices, what will be left? Actually, I think for a lot of routine and mundane tasks, it's great to be able to offload those to a device that we can count on, that is reliable, and then free up that mental bandwidth for the kinds of thinking that only humans can engage in, higher level cognition, like planning and imagining and creating. At the same time, we have to use our digital devices skillfully. Like any mental extension, the trick is in how you use them. And there are certainly ways that we end up using our devices so that they don't extend our minds at all. They're actually sort of contracting our minds. And just one example of that is this common idea that kids don't need to learn facts anymore because they can just Google it, and what they need to do is learn how to think. But it turns out that in order to engage in the very kinds of thinking that teachers and parents and other adults want kids to learn how to do, they actually need a base of factual information stored in their head. So our use of mental extensions has to be skillful, and it has to be informed, and not just casual or haphazard, if we want to actually use it to think better.
Sure. And thinking of the ways our devices maybe limit our thinking, let's maybe use that as a good point to say, from social media to thinking socially. Can we talk a little bit about how we think?
That's a nice segue, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that third section of the book is about thinking with other people. And I think, another theme that emerged in the book in writing the book is that we may have reached the capacity of the biological brain to deal with we've created a world that is so complex that the biological brain, unaided by other outside resources, is almost not able to keep up. And I think one place where we can see that is that information is so abundant, expertise is so specialized, and frankly, the problems and challenges we face as a society are so complicated and wicked that it's no longer the case that like an individual can tackle those challenges. We actually need to learn how to think together more effectively. because we need the collective intelligence that arises from a group of people thinking almost as one, engaging in a kind of group mind. But that's not really something we learn in our schools or in our workplaces, because we have such an individualistic focus of, an individual achievement, individual accomplishment. And actually, we need to be developing ways to really successfully think together.
Yeah, and how do we navigate? I mean, this is I'm asking you a question here that's probably like, if you can solve this, you deserve a Nobel Prize. But how do we navigate that lust for social validation and social knowledge that we kind of have evolutionarily hardwired into us,
Mm.
that makes us drawn towards this medium that hosts the thoughts of billions,
Hmm.
when in reality those billions of thoughts are probably exposing us to forms of suffering and controversy and outrage and just unnecessary information that doesn't actually benefits us, and yet we kind of obsess, for it. We want it, but it's not really
Yeah.
helping us to think. It's
No.
clouding our thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, the designers of social media platforms and other phenomena of the digital era have very successfully hacked, our sort of primitive nervous systems and biological brains. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't sort of hack those biological realities for good. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's we're all starting with the same basic equipment, and we all have these universal capacities and universal limitations. It's deeply unfortunate that they've been hacked in order to make money, basically. And we've seen some pretty awful consequences of that. But I have hope that, having seen that there'll be a movement to tap into those very human characteristics and tendencies, but in a positive direction. I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm with you. So let's move this a little bit out of the realm of theory, I suppose, and a little bit more into the realm of practical application. Let's say, for instance, a lot of our listeners are entrepreneurs or people working in the realm of business. Are there things that maybe, as like a manager or a leader or as somebody who's like trying to be a better member of an organization, are there things that we can do to kind of utilize some of the techniques in your book to think better?
For sure. Yeah. I think, managers and leaders can really think of themselves as sort of situation creators. How can I create a context in which my coworkers and my employees are going to be thinking intelligently? And some of those ways might be allowing people free movement of their bodies and not requiring people to work at their desks. Allowing people to go outside and spend time outside to refresh their attention. And then, probably most relevantly, creating social contexts where people can harness the power of the social brain. I think we often think of work life or intellectual life and social life as separate and distinct and even opposed to each other. It's like we go to work, we do our work, and then we go out for happy hour afterwards. But in fact, humans are social all the time. We're fundamentally social beings, and it doesn't make sense to try to turn that off when we're at the office. So if we can instead harness our innate sociability through activities like storytelling and arguing and debating with each other and teaching other people, then we bring in this whole suite of other of cognitive abilities that remain dormant when we're just alone thinking, sitting at our desk, maybe with our earbuds in and not interacting with other people. So the more we can bring sociability and social life into the workplace in a productive way, I think the more intelligently people will be thinking.
I feel like that's beautiful, but so antithetical to so many of the current paradigms. Yeah, there's a real fear, right? And maybe this is something that I think is really relevant to your work, but there is a real fear about bringing the social life into the business
Mm-hmm.
world.
Mm-hmm.
People, especially now, people are afraid of having the wrong social view or the wrong social
Yeah.
stance or being socially awkward.
Mm-hmm.
and then getting
Mm-hmm.
fired because they didn't socialize correctly.
Yeah, I know. I guess I don't think that the answer is to be afraid of our social natures, but again, to learn to use them more skillfully and to direct that social impulse into productive thought and work. And that it's not how we're used to thinking. We're used to thinking of workers being sort of in their individual bubbles and then maybe getting together for a meeting and then separating out again. And there are some benefits, as I write in the book, to what's known as intermittent collaboration, spending some time alone thinking and then interacting with other people, because I don't want anyone to think that I'm advocating something like the open office, which is I actually, as I write in the book, is actually a really terrible way to try to do complex cognitive work, because human beings are so primed for distraction. I mean, that's an evolutionary advantage, to be attuned to your surroundings, because there could be a reward or a threat out there, and you have to be attuned to those things. But for that very reason, an open office is just a nightmare of distractions that pull you out of the deep work that you want to be doing and you want your employees to be doing. So what we need to do is actually use walls, like we used to have when we had offices, to protect us from our own tendency to be drawn into the distractions that sort of fill the open office.
This is going to be a personal question because, as you're saying that, I love working in coffee shops,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and I love the noise and the movement around me. And I've thought about why this is, and I've realized
mm-hmm,
that it's because when I sit at home and I work, I feel like I'm missing out on the world, so I have like a sense of FOMO. But
mm-hmm,
when I'm
mm-hmm.
in the public, I kind of settle down because I feel okay. Well, if anything's gonna happen, I'm kind of already out in there.
You're
So
in the middle of you're in the mix. Yeah. Yeah, I've I've had people ask me that, because I think most people agree with me that the open office is pretty awful, but then people will say, but I really do like working in a coffee shop, and that's noisy and there's certainly lots of distractions. And my theory about that is that in a coffee shop, you do have, there's some anonymity. You're not surrounded by
mm,
your coworkers. You're not surrounded by people who are going to grab you and say, hey, can you help me with this, or I have a question for you, or something. You're in public, but you're also have this sort of bubble of anonymity and privacy around you. And for some people, that mix of the stimulation that you're talking about, the sort of buzzy atmosphere in a coffee shop, and that bit of anonymity and privacy is kind of the perfect balance for getting work done. But I think that just speaks again to the importance of context, that you actually are going to have different thoughts and do different work at home versus in a coffee shop. I mean, we are that sensitive to where we are.
yeah, which was hugely impactful for my consciousness during COVID, which maybe brings us to another fantastic topic. How do you think COVID has affected the way people think, considering that it's so drastically altered our social interaction, our environment, and really even our movement, because we're not commuting. Maybe we're just sitting at home. Like, it feels like COVID is a direct
Mm.
correlate to your book in a lot of ways right now.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've come to think of the pandemic as a kind of gigantic natural experiment, where a lot of us had our mental extensions cut off or taken away from us very abruptly. So we have been for 18 months now, or however long it's been, like a lot of us have felt like brains in front of screens. We're not getting up and moving as we would if we were still going into the office. We don't have that commute anymore, and we're not some professors, for example, have told me that they are not able to go into their offices, and they realize that their books on their shelves around them were acting as a kind of mental scaffold, and they feel disoriented because their externalized brain is not available to them anymore. And then of course a lot of us have not interacted with people in person nearly as much as we did before. And I think a lot of us are feeling it. We're feeling in a way that we would not have been aware of before, how important those mental extensions are to intelligent thought.
Yeah. And as you were writing this, were there any aha moments? Like, obviously you set out to write this book with intention or knowledge of the fascinating topics that exist within this realm, but was there something that you came across during the writing process that like really surprised
Mm.
you?
Hmm. Yes, I mean, I think one of the pieces of research that had the biggest impact on me and the way I do my work as a writer is this idea of cognitive offloading. And again, this idea that we have a notion that experts or people who are good at their jobs do everything in their heads, and actually that's mistaken. Experts are actually turn out to be those people who are most skilled at using these external resources, using their bodies, using physical spaces, using the minds of other people. That's what makes them experts, is that they're really good at doing those things. So I have really tried to implement this idea of cognitive offloading, getting stuff out of your head and getting it out into physical space where you can manipulate ideas and information as if it's physical objects, or navigate through it as if it's a 3D landscape. And I'm really aware now that when you're able to use your embodied resources that way, you actually can think much better than if you just keep it all inside your head, where it doesn't have an opportunity to be changed or enhanced by contact with the world.
And where do you think this goes as someone who's basically acting as a social scientist very much in the capacity of writing this book? Where do you feel like we're going? Is it a positive direction? Is it a negative direction? Are we being better about thinking in these ways? Is our environment really lacking? Is technology screwing everything up? Like,
yeah, well, I tend to be an optimist, and I see for one thing the pandemic, as I said, sort of alerting people to the fact that we do have bodies, we do exist, and we are embedded in physical spaces, and where we are makes a difference. And also, we have all felt the impact of not being physically present with other people. So I am hoping, and I see this happening in particular in education, that we can embrace the fact that we are whole human beings, that we're not just sort of brains on legs, and that we're not computers either, that we have to understand ourselves as evolved biological creatures who are actually more like animals than like machines, and that's a real paradigm shift from the way we've been taught to regard ourselves.
yeah, absolutely. That reminder that we are animals, I think, is a very important one.
Yeah.
Well, okay,
Yes.
I know we're coming up a little bit on time here, so I don't want to run over, but I do want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about anything that you're working on now, or just direct people to where they can find the extended mind and your most recent work.
Yes, sure. So I am very active on Twitter, and I encourage anyone who's listening to reach out to me there. My handle is at Annie Murphy Paul. And I have a newsletter that I just launched this week, actually. It's called Thinking Outside the Brain. And one thing I'm really excited about is that I'm starting what I'm calling a cognitive advice column, because, so often advice columns are about our emotions and our relationships, and those things are so important. But I find that many of our biggest struggles are really with ourselves and our minds. And so my idea is to bring the wisdom and the knowledge generated by cognitive science and psychology to bear on these questions that I think are just as important, which is how do we manage our mental lives, not just our emotional lives. And so I'm really excited about that, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with readers.
Has that come out yet, or is it
The
coming out
first
soon?
one is the first one is coming out tomorrow.
Oh, wonderful. Good timing
Yeah,
then.
yeah,
So,
yeah. I'll give you a preview. It's about people who feel, and this is something I've heard from a lot of people who fidget, who feel compelled to move a lot when they're working or thinking, but are embarrassed about that, or
I don't know what you're
think,
about to say, but that's definitely
yeah,
me.
who have been made to feel embarrassed or ashamed, or like they should, just be still, and so I'm writing about how that's actually fidgeting is actually a way of modulating our level of arousal in a very granular and effective way. And it's something that we should be encouraging rather than shaming people for. So
Good. I
stay
like
tuned for
this.
that.
This is
Yeah.
this is good news. I do the facial hair thing all the time. That's my addiction. Well, wonderful. By the time this airs, that should be out, so
It'll
we'll
be
link
out
to
there.
it in the show
Yeah.
notes. Annie, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me in this conversation.
Thank you, Stephen. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.